Welcome back to the Bringing the Human Back to Human Resources podcast. Thank you so much for being here for another week. You know what to do. If you haven't yet, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you're catching this episode, whether you're watching, listening, running, Pelotoning. It doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're sitting doing your makeup, I don't know. Just make sure that you ensure that you get these episodes every week. This week, I'm really excited. I have two guests who I actually have had the pleasure of meeting in person because I was invited to one of their events in the city, which was so much fun, by the way. But we're talking all about their company, Flora, and it's, we'll be talking about really the advent of Flora and how it has completely transformed the fertility benefits that are provided and afforded to people really around the world. And Flora is doing something very unique. So before we get into that, I'm going to introduce you to Dr. Christy Lane and Laura McDonald. So first, Dr. Christy Lane, I have your bio up here first. So I'm going to have you sit through your bio and hear all of the amazing things that you have done throughout your career. Dr. Christy Lane is a global leader of InsurTech, an investor, founder, and award-winning health scientist with expertise in AI, digital health, and wearable devices. Dr. Lane is the co-founder of Flora Fertility, the Stanford Wearable Health Lab, as well as founder and former CEO of Viva Metrica. Dr. Lane is also a venture partner with IA Capital, an InsurTech fintech venture firm in New York. She has built her career in women's health research since the 90s and is blazing a new path forward to combine critical components of wearable tech to help inform insurance policies to make fertility treatments more accessible. And who can't get behind that, As a mom of three, Dr. Lane has gone through IVF herself and deeply understands the emotional and financial challenges of treatment. She's been recognized as top 40 under 40 in Calgary, Female Founders of InsurTech winner, and a top 20 women in tech. So Dr. Lane, congrats to you. Those are some amazing achievements and accolades. And now, Laura, I have the pleasure of introducing you as well. Laura McDonald is the co-founder of Flora Fertility and CEO of Flora Fertility, the first individually owned insurance solution for fertility and women's health. She formerly founded, scaled, and sold Canada's largest financial media company focused on women and wealth, and is passionate about educating women about financial freedom and helping them achieve those goals. Another thing I think we can all get behind, frankly. She has guided product wholesaling for a major insurance company and helped scale a direct-to-consumer AI model in the e-commerce space to have global market adoption across over 100 countries. She is a mother of four and the author of two best-selling personal finance books and a former media personality in the financial sector. So Dr. Lane, Laura, thank you so much for being here. And I'm super excited for all the listeners to better understand Flora Fertility.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Tracy. And again, so nice to meet you in person when you came to our event. Yes. So we've been looking forward to this.
It was a fabulous event. And I have to say, my friend and I, who I brought with me to the event, thank you for the +1. I didn't think that it was the right event for my husband to join me considering, it was one of those things where I was like, oh, I could see my friend and I could bring my friend to this and this could be really interesting for her. And it was, and we loved the lipstick readers that basically told us our fortunes. Yeah. And to me, I was like, I don't care if there's science behind this. It was fabulous. I heard all of the wonderful things about myself. I got to wear a lipstick. It was awesome. It was a really wonderful event. So kudos to
I love that you experienced that. I actually, just side note, I didn't do the lipstick fortune teller. It's like when you're at your own wedding and you don't try a lot of the food and you don't talk to a lot of people. So but it was a well planned, and I know a lot of people were excited about that. So love that you enjoyed it.
Totally. No, it was fabulous. And I think it really helped me to better understand what you and the Flora team are doing. And so maybe that's actually the perfect place to start, is helping the listeners to better understand Flora and where the inspiration and motivation, especially considering both of your backgrounds, where that came from to say, hey, there's a gap in this world of, benefits and perks and coverage for women. I'd love to know more.
So we always have trouble remembering like how long ago this was, but now it's going on over 3 years ago, that we were each kind of thinking about this on our own and from a bit of a different angle. My story was, I do have 4 kids. My kids are older, so it's hard to remember, like 20, 18, 17, three daughters, and then a son who's 12. And so I had my kids kind of back to back in my 20s, my first three, and I didn't go through fertility challenges. Actually, 20 years ago, you really weren't even aware, honestly, if that others might be going through it. It was kind of kept very quiet. And so fast forward to 3 years ago, I was seeing my cousin, who's like a sister to me, go through fertility treatment. And she was living in a major city where people had, pretty high incomes, but they were still struggling to afford treatment. Even when there's some sort of grants, whether it's state grant or provincial, the coverage is still very limited. And so I was seeing that her support group became mothers going through treatment. And while it's certainly a medical crisis, it's equally a financial crisis. And so my background's been in the world of finance and bringing new products to market across insurance as well. And I was kind of going to bed at night thinking there has to be a better way to fund treatment. And can insurance play a role? And so I was fortunate to get introduced to Christy through a common connection we had at a large reinsurer who said that we should meet. And I'll let her take it from here, telling her story.
Great. Thanks, Laura. Laura's absolutely right about the fact that, years ago, people weren't talking about infertility. As you mentioned in my intro, Tracy, I did go through it personally.
Mm-hmm.
So the fun fact between Laura and I, we have 7 kids, ranging from Laura's oldest is 20 to my youngest is 4. And we're the same age. So it just tells you a little bit about the different paths women and families take. But
Mm-hmm.
I did go through infertility. And so my oldest is now almost 12. And so this would have been like, 2010-ish. And nobody was talking about infertility. And it was very isolating. There wasn't any community, right? So I later found out that people that I knew were going through it as well, but nobody was talking about it. And layer on the fact that even living in Canada, where we have socialized medicine, I was paying out of pocket. And so at the time thinking, it seems wild. I was shocked at the time. And given my background in, medical sciences, the fact that I was surprised by it is telling. It's just, there was no education. So, that was a while ago thinking about how we could solve for the financial side, but also the community side, right? Bringing women together, helping them understand their bodies, their reproductive physiology, and potentially putting them on a path to, successfully having a baby on their own terms. And then, Laura and I were at that time, I was building a different company, but 3 years ago when Laura and I were introduced, it just made a lot of sense to build it. We have very complementary backgrounds. I'm coming from the, predictive modeling side of new underwriting, that kind of thing, the scientific product side of things. And Laura has experience in bringing these types of products to market. So it just made sense. And the timing
totally
was
symbiotic. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you both for sharing more about, kind of the inception of Flora. When I, and frankly, I think maybe I've even shared this with you also, I have not struggled with infertility, which does feel like a blessing in some ways, given some of the challenges that women and families, let's say, experience when they are experiencing infertility. And it's so interesting because let me think. By the time this episode comes out, I think I'll be 34. But I'm 33 right now as we're recording. And as you know, I'm pregnant with my third. So by the time this episode comes out, I will hopefully welcome a healthy child into the world. But it's so interesting because I have, of course, a lot of friends that are similar ages to me. And some have struggled with fertility, or they've struggled with having some, underlying health factors that maybe make their fertility more of a challenge.
Yeah.
And I think about how when we were growing up, and Chrissy, you kind of were just talking about this too, there wasn't a whole lot of conversation around that. And now with the advent of social media, I think it's kind of something that's almost unavoidable. If I feel like I follow so many female content creators who talk about their struggles with fertility. And even though it's not necessarily something that I have necessarily had to resonate with, I find it so interesting because it makes me wonder how many women struggle with fertility or have, challenges with fertility because maybe they are not starting their family planning until later in life. So I'm curious if you have some statistics around how many women and families experience infertility or maybe benefit from IVF and other types of treatments.
It's 1 in 6. And in
Wow.
some cases in North America, 1 in 5 people will need some kind of treatment for infertility. The interesting thing though, is that there's a big focus on IVF in social media. So you talk
Yeah.
about people going through fertility journeys. A lot of the time that's really the focus of the conversation, both from the media side, but also from the financial side in terms of what products are available in the market. And it really is only about 10% of those 1 in 6 that end up needing IVF. So there's
Oh,
this
wow.
whole spectrum. I know it's surprising to
Yeah.
a lot of people. There's this whole spectrum of treatment, including just consultation, finding out what's going on often is all that needs to happen. Maybe you just have irregular cycles through diagnostics and then medications and something called IUI. And 90% of people are successful with those other treatments. And so that's an interesting piece of it, is that there's a whole breadth of available pathways for women, and IVF really is just one of them.
Wow.
Just to add to that, I know when we talked kind of how many women needed and experienced it, but the awareness, talking about that, the awareness from social media, you made a really good point, Tracy, that we're starting. The awareness is there because we're all sharing our stories online, social media. Beyond that, and I was just on an investor call the other day, and he, as he got on the call, he said, "I'm an IVF baby," is how he introduced me.
Wow.
And I was like, that is why the awareness is so real right now, because we're having this whole generation that's coming into adulthood because they were born, because their parents went through fertility treatment. And if we think about it, the oldest IVF baby is in their late 40s. But it was still pretty rare back then. So again, people in their 20s, 30s, there's lots of people walking around now that were born because of their parents had fertility treatment. And so that awareness is very real. And when we were building this model, we really wanted to understand, would people be interested in this? Would they buy it? Would employers support it? And what we found was that over 50% of young women in particular are now concerned or aware about their future fertility. And a new study showed even as high as 72% by the age of 23 are thinking about it. So
Wow.
we weren't thinking about it 40 years ago because it wasn't even a possibility. But now this is definitely not a niche topic. It's very real. And it's one of the hottest topics, if you will, among young women.
Wow. That is really, really interesting. And I think that this is actually a really good reflection point into why Flora is so different from actually, and really the first of its kind, but why it's so different from what maybe others have seen where their employers, especially if they're larger employers with better group insurance coverage, that they have access to things, that others might not have access to. And Flora specifically, my understanding, of course, keep me honest here, is that it's not just group insurance. It's a plan that people own and control individually, which is really very unique, probably in any health-based benefit that employees see or receive anywhere. And so I'd love to dig in a little bit deeper into understanding what does make Flora different. Of course, that feels like it's just kind of the tip of the iceberg, and maybe even why something like this hasn't existed before.
When we were developing Flora, we were looking at the existing offerings, and you're right, a lot of them were group benefits plans, typically available only through Fortune 500 companies, because group benefit plans are typically very, very expensive. So unless you're working for a Google or a big bank, you simply didn't have access to those. We really wanted to make it more affordable and more accessible, whether you work for a big company, whether you work for a small, medium business, or even if you're going out on your own, your contractor, your gig economy. The average person is going to work 12 plus jobs in their lifetime. So they need something that moves with them. And so Flora is the first individually underwritten, individually owned fertility insurance policies. And I'll let Christy sort of explain what that means. But in essence, what it means to the consumer is that it's in your name. So think about life insurance that's in your name and not just your employer's name. Your employer can choose to support it and sponsor it, and they can actually do it really affordably. But if you decide to leave the company, you can take that policy with you. You just start paying the premiums. We've made it really affordable, anywhere from approximately $15 to $70 a month to have up to $50,000 of lifetime coverage available to you. So that's actually double most group plans that are available. And it really is the first one, because of the depth of the models that we built and because we have reinsurers backing this product. So we're really looking at future risk and offsetting that future risk. And we can do that by having amazing global reinsurers backing the product. And that allows us to really give really robust coverage to our policyholders. And Christy, I don't know if you want to expand on the individual underwriting and how that's different from group.
Yeah, absolutely. So the critical piece, if you will, of our model is the fact that it's the first ever individually underwritten, meaning instead of risk pooling. So say in group insurance, for example, an employer will pay for everybody in their group, whether or not they're going to use that product or not. And what happens in a group model is you have something called anti-selection, meaning you don't know who's in that group. You don't know what the magnitude of risk is. And so often those policies end up being quite expensive because you need to cover that risk. What we're doing is looking at each woman to start, and eventually men, but each woman to start and saying, what is your individual risk? And how do we price that appropriately so that it can be affordable, but so we can also cover the risk and pay for your claims if and when you need them. And so you asked Tracy, like, why hasn't this been done before? It might sound trite, but because it's hard. It's a combination of, deep domain expertise in women's health and fertility, really understanding what drives infertility, but also what drives claims propensity, but also the ability to execute through, as Laura mentioned, getting capacity from reinsurers. That's a big deal. It's very hard to do. And also setting up the entire regulatory structure of a brand new product, right? This is, I was talking to someone else this morning who are thinking about doing something in life insurance. There are thousands, tens of thousands of life insurance products on the market. It's a known entity, whereas this had never been done. So it's a lot around, the background we have, and frankly, the network we have in insurance to be able to get
Fabulous.
it off.
Fabulous. I mean, I think it's really unique and it makes a whole lot of sense, especially Laura, you mentioned the statistic that most people will have around 12 jobs or experiences in their career. I mean, that's kind of wild when you really think about it, and how imperative it is to have control over and access to benefits such as this, when it comes to fertility. And Christy, you mentioned something about eventually men as well. And of course, maybe I shouldn't say of course, but certainly some fertility challenges are linked to men. And so I am curious then, like, is that kind of the next frontier for Flora? Because naturally, when I think most people, frankly, not to generalize, but most people probably think about fertility just from this women's kind of owned perspective, that women are the ones that are fertile or infertile or have comorbidities or underlying health conditions that make it more difficult, and that men are not necessarily in that same category or susceptible to some of the same challenges. But it sounds like maybe there's some thought around how it's, how the framework goes beyond just women. Is that fair?
It is about 50%. of
Oh,
infertility
wow.
challenges are on the male side. But the interesting thing is there's not a lot that can be done about it for men, right? So
Interesting.
it's either usually, it could be lifestyle. So, right, there are behaviors that are known to impact, sperm counts, sperm quality, including, smoking, cannabis, other types of drugs, lack of physical activity. So those are things that are modifiable, but a lot of it is just potentially physical blockage. And in that case, that requires surgery. But the vast majority of the treatable parts of infertility are on the female side. And so while we do understand and want to support the male partner in this scenario, that is something that we would have to build new models for.
Mm-hmm.
The good news, though, is that most of the treatments for men, if you're going down the path of, say, IUI or IVF, are actually covered under the same treatment codes as the women. So if you're, as a couple, going through IVF, for example, the payment for like the sperm extraction and the spinning of it and all of that, that is actually covered under a bundled ICD-10 code.
Oh,
And
wow.
so we do a lot of it's actually covered under the woman under a Flora policy. But maybe,
Very
Laura, if you want to
interesting.
talk about maybe men not buying it as early as women.
Yeah, when creating this product, we were looking at, and the way it's priced is similar to life insurance. The earlier you buy the product, the cheaper it is. Age is a big risk factor.
Mm-hmm.
You lock in that premium for sort of the life of the policy. So whether you're buying it on your own or whether your employer is supporting it, that's all factored in. And we really, when we were building it, we thought it was more likely that young women, and they can, in their 20s or 30s, would buy it proactively more than maybe young men would. Though we are hearing there is definitely a shift in men thinking about their fertility at younger ages. But as Christy referenced, most of the treatments are borne by the female partner, and those are covered under a Flora policy. Now, one way we look at male infertility or risk is some of our partners. We have partners in this space related to your microbiome, your hormonal data, all these things that can impact your fertility. And one of them as well looks at sperm optimization. Men typically have 10 weeks before conception where they can optimize their sperm through lifestyle behaviors. So one of our partners helps with that. But as Christy said, we're focusing on the female partner right now. And when you create a net new insurance product, you cannot just, no way would you get reinsurance back if you said we're going to cover every single person, every single condition. You really have to narrow it down. But it's still a very big market for us. And we really think it's important for women in particular to own their reproductive health outcomes. Your job you can be let go from your job. You don't know what your health plan will or will not cover in the future. If it's in your name, it is yours, no matter what. This is private insurance that you own and control, but that your employer can also support.
Absolutely. I love that you talked about the age factor as well. I mean, certainly there are a number of people that I can think about even in my own network who have opted in essence for, talking about their fertility even before they're, in that stage where they're ready to family plan in any, event. And one of the things that generally comes up is egg freezing, which I believe Flora does not necessarily cover today. And so I'm curious if egg freezing is something that is kind of like a totally different ball game, or if there's something, maybe that Flora is hoping to kind of bring into the fold down the line, especially understanding and appreciating how difficult it is to enter into this market as the first of its kind and to get things lifted off the ground. I mean, certainly the $50,000 lifetime coverage is quite a number, and hopefully, I would imagine, provides a significant amount of coverage for most people. But egg freezing, of course, is one of those things that people tend to talk about quite a bit, especially, considering it's recommended that you do any type of egg freezing earlier on because the quality of a woman's eggs are greater, I guess, when she's younger, the younger she is, so to speak. I'm obviously not an expert on this, but just out of curiosity, what are your thoughts there?
So just to clarify, we do cover medically required egg
Oh,
freezing or medically recommended egg freezing. So, if, for example, unfortunately you need to undergo chemotherapy or some other kind of treatment for a comorbid condition and your physician recommends that you freeze your eggs, we do cover that. The piece that we
got it. So
don't,
it's the elective.
it's the elective egg freezing. It's the preventative. And the reason is, you said mathematically, um, if we were to sell someone a policy that cost $20 a month and everybody froze their eggs, then, it's hard for the business.
Sure.
That being said, we are thinking about and having some serious conversations about what a egg freezing product could look like.
I would say
Amazing.
we really look at it as both an alternative and a complement to egg freezing. So if you're in your, let's say, early mid 20s, you may not need to look at egg freezing at that point in time. It's very expensive. It's invasive. When you actually look at the numbers, only about 6 to 15% of people actually end up using their frozen eggs. So you're putting out a lot of dollars, you're putting your body through something, and there's a good chance you'll never use those eggs. Also, if you egg freeze and you need to use those eggs, that's IVF. That's 100% IVF down the road. So that's another very invasive procedure. So I would say if you're in your, if you're in your 20s, buy a Flora policy. That's actually, a young woman said to me, I'm hearing that freezing my eggs is the only way to ensure my future fertility. And she said, you just made me realize I actually just need an insurance policy. So think of it as an alternative in your 20s. If you're getting into your late 20s, your 30s, and you opt to freeze your eggs, absolutely go for it, but you should still have a Flora policy, because depending on your risk profile, you've already invested so heavily in freezing your eggs. Depending on your risk profile, there's a good chance we can still offer you a Flora policy. And so for, say, at around that age, it might be $40, $50 a month. If you need to use those eggs in the future, you will have the dollars to do that. And so we really do try to align with egg freezing in different ways. And as Christy mentioned, hopefully down the road, that's something we can incorporate. It's just a tricky one in terms of elective, because as we said, from a mathematical perspective, it just doesn't work to pay $20, $30 a month and then be able to spend $15,000 1 year later on egg freezing.
Of course. And it makes total sense. And actually, I think that this is helping to unveil a bit of a misconception, actually, around what we, normies might understand about fertility and fertility treatments. And Laura, to your point, and really both of your points, when someone if they use their eggs, if at all, then they're going through IVF, and that necessitates additional coverage anyway. And coverage that otherwise they wouldn't have. And you're talking, to your point, about tens of thousands of dollars if they don't have coverage from Flora, for example. And when I think about these misconceptions, I certainly can relate this a little bit to where, people are kind of reliant on either their governments or their employers for coverage and understanding. And I've had guests on in the past who have talked about, different types of benefits and perks, whether health or financial and otherwise. And a lot of what the conversation comes down to is education for the benefactor, right? So in this case, the employee. And naturally, with Flora being an individually owned policy with coverage, there's inherently that built-in education understanding that, fertility coverage can look totally different for so many people, and egg freezing is not the only thing. And Laura, I really appreciate that you shared that example from one woman who said that they thought that that was their only option. And so I'm curious if there are other misconceptions out there, or potentially even ways for people to further educate themselves to kind of unveil those other misconceptions.
What I would say, which I'm kind of answering your question, kind of not, I think just on the whole, there's just a lack of education around infertility in general and what that means, right? Because as I think I mentioned earlier on, it could mean just that you have undiagnosed PCOS. That was me, right? I ended up figuring out I had no idea I had it. Frankly, I didn't even really know what it was. And, or that you just have irregular cycles, through to you actually have severe endometriosis and you require different kinds of treatment. So one of the things that, I think we're most excited about is the ability to provide that education and starting from the earliest day, right? So if you're someone in your 21 and you buy a policy, you're probably not going to have a lot of medical education around what drives infertility. What are your risks? What are the lifestyle factors associated with infertility? You know, people ask, does smoking impact infertility? Yes. Does alcohol? Yes. You know, things that, but those are going to be very different questions than someone who's, you know, 34 and trying to get pregnant. That would be more around, what are my options? What are the potential, you know, medical barriers that I might run into? And so for us, I think it's a lot around really opening up the conversation, which is already starting to happen, and helping women understand their reproductive physiology and the fact that challenges are perfectly normal and that there are solutions for them. And then the last thing I'll say is, I do think the focus on IVF is a misconception, where people think if I'm going to need fertility treatment, that's the only path. And honestly, a lot of the times, you know, 9 out of 10 times you don't end up needing IVF. So that's a piece of the education for us as well, both from the medical side, but also from the financial side of
And on
planning.
that IVF issue, so I know when we look at how we established our lifetime amount of coverage, which is 50,000, for some people, they'll go, well, what about somebody who needs to go through 5 rounds of IVF? Or there was an article, I think in the Wall Street Journal this past weekend, that one couple had gone through like 300,000 to afford fertility treatment. That's upsetting across the board. It's incredibly expensive. How can anybody afford that? There are certainly cases where it is, you know, we're getting into the 100 grand plus for fertility treatment. But when we look at the average, it's around 50,000. And the reason that is because, again, we focus on IVF, and are those terrible cases where you're going through 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rounds at 15, 20,000 a round. But looking at that bigger picture, when we look at that, up to 90% of cases are treated in those earlier stages, people are still, it's still costing them a fair amount. It might be 5,000, 10,000, 20,000. Those diagnostics, the medications, the IUI, they all cost, but it's not going to get up to that 100 grand. And so that's how our model takes into account an average of 50,000. But you also don't want to just focus on IVF. There's some insurance plans out there that do, because again, people are still shelling out in a clinical workflow, often pre-IVF, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 that comes before that. And so just really understanding, I think the 2 things we hear in the media are egg freezing and IVF. They get a lot of attention, but fertility and infertility, it's much broader than that. And the really good news is there's so much emerging data and science. When we talked about vaginal microbiome, that's shown to be really interesting. If we're looking at STDs, that might prevent needing IVF down the road. The hormonal data, there's so many interesting companies and people doing really interesting things in this space. So we're going to see a big evolution in how we're able to detect and treat fertility going forward.
I do have to say real quick to that note, because it made me kind of, you know, reflect. I just met this awesome company out of Stanford, and they're building a non-invasive hormone tracking wearable device. And, you know, that's able to track all of the critical hormones. And it made me think back to when I was trying to get pregnant, and I wish I had it here. I literally had this little machine, okay, and there were pee sticks. So you had to pee on the stick, and then you had to stick it into this machine, and then all you got was a sad face, like kind of like a flat looking face, or a happy face. And that was it. But that was like revolutionary technology 15 years ago, right? Where you were like, okay, I know I have an irregular cycle. This will help me. So to Laura's point, I think, you know, it's both the emerging predictive science around infertility, but also the reproductive medicine science is just getting better and better. The success rates are higher. The, you know, personalized medicine is getting better, where it's like right treatment for the right person at the right time. Whereas back, you know, the oldest IVF babies 45 plus years ago, that wasn't around. We didn't have AI Now you have AI models running on the sperm quality, running on the egg count, running on the hormones to say, this is what you should do and why. And, that will give you your highest chance of success. So we're in a really
Right.
interesting era right now, I think, for where the
Yeah.
technology is helping a lot.
Yeah. So interesting. And I do think that people's just overall awareness will help in improving and increasing all of that data, because it's something that's so important to people naturally. Some people go their whole lives, saying, I don't want to get pregnant yet. And then when they do want to get pregnant, they
Right.
have, right? They have trouble sometimes. Like, this is like it's like one of those sad jokes is that, as a woman, you're like, okay, I need to be on birth control. I need to do this. I need to do whatever, whatever I can do not to have a baby until I'm ready. And then you're ready. And sometimes it just doesn't shake out the way
And then
that
you're
you hope.
shocked.
Yeah. And you're like,
That
what do
was
you
me. I
mean?
was like,
Yeah.
I'm very type A, okay, yeah, I'm going to do this with my life. I'm going to do this. And then I'm going to have a baby. In my head, I was like, I want to have a baby at 31 and 33. Sounds like what you did, Tracy.
Pretty much. Yeah.
And it literally just did not work out that way. And it was so frustrating. But also what was frustrating too was that came as a bit of a surprise to me. Like, how did I end up here? And so I do think the exciting thing is that the conversation is happening. More women are tracking their cycles now. They're thinking about it. They're doing things like egg freezing.
I know.
So yeah.
Christy said, I think you said once in another interview we did that you were just so used to that if you put in the hard work, as I think a lot of women feel, if we put in the hard work, it's going to happen, right? No matter what we put our mind to. And that doesn't necessarily happen, right? When it comes time to have kids. So I loved that. It totally made sense. That's our mindset. And this is something we just can't.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I've seen.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. And there are some content creators who I follow who have kind of vulnerably talked about how they feel like their body fails them. And, they spend all this time working out and eating well and using, non-toxic ingredients and things. And then they're like, why is my body failing me? And I think this is where, when I think about Flora and what it's allowing women in particular and having this individually owned coverage, it's giving them a sense of control, which 100%. Otherwise you don't necessarily feel when you are, what I imagine, struggling with trying to start a family. And so that sense of control is like, I don't know, as someone who is also very type A, that is like one of the most peaceful things that I can think about is like having control over something, maybe to my husband's dismay, but I love, like, no one loves having control more than someone who is like, maybe like us and really planned, but really in general, like when you feel in control of something like your body and your fertility and your ability to get pregnant, whatever that means to someone, then there is this, you kind of have this whole world open up for you. And so, I realize we've talked a lot about what Flora does and how it's different and things like that. But I'm also curious, especially since so many listeners are in business and they're in HR, how they can support individuals, either themselves or at their companies, to have access to Flora. Like, are there employers who are, reimbursing for Flora's coverage, for example, or are there unique ways that they can bring this back to their companies, for just more engagement of their population?
So fertility benefits are very much in demand. As many as 88% of women are asking for these types of benefits at work. And when we were building this, again, the group models that are out there, because they're very expensive. So they're typically only available at companies with, 5,000 employees or more. Smaller groups are typically excluded either because their group is too small, the anti-selection is too high, or the coverage is just too expensive. And so for employers, it's very simple with Flora. You decide, who you want to offer it to at work. It could be all your, female employees that fit within our age range, spouses. It could be adult children of some of your employees. And they simply go through the underwriting process. You decide how much of the premium you want to pay, whether it's 100%, 50%, 25%, and then the policy is issued to them. And you're really there supporting it. It doesn't need to be tied to open enrollment. You know exactly what your costs are going to be as an employer. So there's no risk of your utilization costs spiking out of control. And that's what we're seeing a lot with the existing group models. So it's really meant to be affordable and accessible and very beneficial for your employees.
And from a super practical standpoint, all we do is create a co-branded landing page for you, for your company. So you would send it out to those, as Laura said, those eligible employees. They would just go through the regular online underwriting process, and then we just bill the employer directly. And the thing that I gained a lot more understanding from, we actually pitched on the employee benefit stage at HLTH this year, last month. Oh my goodness. And, so many employers were struck by how easy it was, right? The fact that, as Laura mentioned, it doesn't have to be open enrollment. You can offer this at any time of the year. And then you're only on the hook as an employer to pay for the premiums. You're paying the premiums. The claims themselves are borne by Flora because of our reinsurance backing. Whereas some of these other group plans, you're actually paying for the rounds of treatment themselves, in addition to PEPM fees, eligible employee fees. So not only is it more affordable, but it's accessible throughout the entire year, and very straightforward to do. So if there are any listeners, just reach out.
And I do want to point out, so as we're taping this, the Trump administration came out with some recent guidelines around IVF accessibility. One was on lowering drug costs, which is great. Whether you have insurance or not, that makes your insurance go further. The other one was around employers offering fertility benefits, because it has been out of reach for the vast majority of employers. 60 to 80% of people still have no coverage through work. And it's again because those group plans have been so expensive and those utilization costs so high. And so what the Trump administration was recommending, that we offer fertility benefits outside of traditional group or health plans. And so that is exactly where Flora fits in. Think of it more like a flex or voluntary supplemental benefit that's highly affordable, easy for the employers to offer, and makes it very accessible for employees. So we're really happy to see the administration come out with those guidelines, because it aligns very, very well with our product. And to be honest, there's very few, if any, other providers out there who can match what we've built here. And again, because of the years of development and the reinsurers backing this product.
Amazing. Yeah, it's seldom we hear good news sometimes. So it's really nice that there's, there are these opportunities for people. And I do think this is where there's this fabulous intersection for the employer and the employee. Like, the employee is like, this is important to me and I'm paying it anyway. This would be an amazing thing to get reimbursed for, and especially considering what the average cost of a plan is, based on your website. I mean, these are things that are ultimately pretty affordable and go a long way from an engagement standpoint, and how employers show their employees how much they care about them. Because fertility, especially, I just think about the mindset of someone who is struggling with fertility or thinking about this, that maybe they'll be that much more engaged and productive in the work that they're doing if this is one less worry that they have in their personal lives. And again, one more thing that they have control over. And so with that, I really appreciate both of you joining the podcast, and especially considering it's Fertility Awareness Month by the time this episode launches. And so I'd love to invite you to share where the listeners can learn more about Flora, where they could connect with you, and hopefully offer these things to their employees, or even just access this coverage for themselves.
Absolutely. Well, so happy to have this conversation today. So thank you for having us. Feel free, anybody can go to our website, heyflora.com. We are both pretty active on LinkedIn as well, so often connect with professionals there. That's probably the best way to reach out to us.
Amazing. Fabulous. Well, thank you both so much again. And I think what you're doing is amazing. And I'm really excited to watch Flora continue to grow and offer so many wonderful options for people.
Thanks so much for having us. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah. Thank you, Tracy.
Amazing.
Appreciate it.
Hey, just before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this show so that you are the first to hear when an episode drops each week. And maybe leave a 5-star review and a comment about how much you loved this episode. Plus, if you have someone in mind who would really enjoy this episode, make sure you share it with them. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next week.